It generally happened, therefore, that at the very moment when the influence of the ministry should have been exerted over public opinion, the public showed itself refractory and mistrustful of whatever bore the stamp of office about it. Those who represented the fact in any other light were working to deceive themselves in order to put on the disguise, at least of candor, when they were attempting to lead astray the very man to whom the evil should have been laid open in all its reality, whilst it still depended upon him to effect its cure. A foreign influence was exercised in Paris by the necessity of a peace which was so generally felt by all. Those who had recently acquired fortunes, which they were desirous to remove from the remotest part of Poland to perhaps the southern extremity of France, the men whose speculations or their continued possessions of lucrative employments wholly depended upon the stability of the imperial institutions, which could only acquire a deep root from the durability of their existence, an existence which every fresh campaign seemed to place in jeopardy. The nation, in short, to a man, foresaw that the loss of a single battle would ruin a multitude of families whose destinies were all stamped for their fortune, or for their ruin on the reverse of the same metal. This conviction threw the public mind into a state of uneasiness and made it susceptible to such rapid and fluctuating changes. Its hopes revived by success, as infallibly as the storm settles into a calm under the genial influence of the sun. No security, however, can be found in a state of uncertainty. The want of confidence in official communications, the only ones held out to the public curiosity, had driven society to feed upon foreign information. From that moment, diplomatic employments were eagerly courted, and many persons thereby obtained what was well described as an unlimited credit upon public credulity. They exchanged the information they had acquired for that which was afforded them in return. A foreign influence was thus exercised over Paris, the baneful effects of which could not be arrested by the immovable silence. It is clear that the administration alone could remedy this evil, but it is not my province, any more than my business, to pronounce judgment upon its conduct. My only object is to describe the unhappy consequences of the course which it was thought proper to pursue. I no sooner discovered this general tendency to seek for foreign information than it became my duty to watch the sources from whence any favorable intelligence, as well as that of a contrary description, emanated, and I then began to direct my attention to the circle of foreign ambassadors. On the day following that of the arrival of any courier, I caused questions to be put to such courier in order to sound the state of the public mind in the country from whence he had been sent, and at the moment of his departure from it, if he was enabled to answer the questions, the succeeding courier was generally better informed. Many intelligent men are to be found amongst cabinet messengers who can write a journal of their travels with as much accuracy as the most clear-sighted staff officer. When the ambassadors of great powers received several couriers at one time and in regular succession, there was less facility in obtaining in that quarter any important information than from the envoys of lesser powers, the correctness of whose intelligence was to them an object of incalculable advantage, as it gave them additional weight at their own courts. Each of the envoys, these lesser powers, moves round the orbit of a greater power, renders it the tribute of its homage, affords it such information as there are means of obtaining, and is allowed to return the privilege of sending his dispatches by the couriers of the former, a necessity imposed upon him by the want of a sufficient pecuniary allowance to afford him the means of sending a special messenger of his own. This envoy avails himself likewise of the patronage created by this mode of communication to inquire for any intelligence from his own court, of which the courier last arrived may have been the bearer. The ambassador is never very open in his communication. Few of them, however, are found to transact their business in person. This duty generally devolves upon the individuals attached to their respective missions. The whole secret consists in ascertaining who is most likely to be well acquainted with the facts which it is desirable to discover. And as this particular inquiry does not appear to conceal any latent object, no one ever shows any reluctance to state the truth, which is no sooner known than it naturally becomes an easy task to find out the private habits of the individuals holding those subaltern employments who are generally found to frequent the middling classes rather than the more elevated ranks of society. The particular tastes or habits of a man are no sooner known than he becomes the tool of whoever can pander to them. I have known agents who were so dexterous in this system of corruption that they would make a gambler of any man who resisted their attacks, would win all his money, involve him, besides, in debt, and after placing him in this dilemma, would enter into composition with him, and be it said, to the disgrace of human nature, seldom failed of complete success. Those men for whom gambling had no attractions were mostly found to be accessible through the artifices of women, in many of whom so much skill and experience were combined that they were very seldom encountered any difficulties which they had it not in their power to overcome. When foreign couriers arrived in Paris, the news which they brought was generally known a few days afterwards, and the same channel of information also furnished me with an abstract of the answers they were directed to take back to their respective courts. I have even occasionally been put in possession of complete copies of their dispatches. It was the prevalent opinion that, in consequence of the emperor's marriage, all ideas of war would thenceforth be relinquished. And it was nevertheless from that moment that the intercourse between foreign powers became more reserved. I particularly allude to the relations between France and Russia, for the language held by England have for many years been uniformly the same. The private intelligence we derived from England and Russia had the effect of disturbing the calm of our repose. That intelligence exhibited an intense curiosity respecting our internal condition, which was looked upon as the thermometer of the events we might have it in our power to display in the event of any fresh war. The small confederated powers of the Rhine were not behindhand in discovering that the political horizon pretended an approaching storm. And as they had become deeply interested in the permanence of the ascendancy of France, which had had the effect of nearly doubling the extent of their political power, they neglected no means of being correctly informed of whatever concerned those interests upon which their own were engrafted. Their ministers at foreign courts accordingly directed their utmost care and vigilance to discover whatever was in agitation, whilst their representatives in Paris exhausted every means to procure information respecting the state of affairs in Spain, the only balance by which they measured the probabilities of peace or war. They could only obtain intelligence of a positive nature on this subject through the correspondence with England, on which they placed the greater reliance, as they frequently had occasion to remark the striking contrast exhibited by English publications as compared with those of France. With regard to the war in Spain, the correspondence with England was of the most limited nature, not so much on the above account as for motives of a private nature. I did not much rely upon the assurances given to me of the faithful execution of the orders which had been issued on this subject. I exercised a strict watch over each arrival and departure. Everything appeared in rule, when I felt an inward foreboding that there existed some clandestine sources of communication which I bent all my attention to discover. I spread the report that I should not be too strict in granting a passport for England to anyone who might be strongly recommended as incapable of mixing in political affairs, but under the express condition that he would keep his departure a profound secret, as I neither wished to be importuned for many such passports, nor to be placed under the necessity of refusing those who might flatter themselves that I would yield to their entreaties. This report could not fail to produce the desired effect. I was at first applied to for 1 or 2 passports, which I promised, though under various pretexts, not until the expiration of a few days. The fact was, I had my precautions to adopt, and I accordingly soon ascertained that letters were preparing for England in certain houses of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. I also got my own letters in readiness from my chief commissary police at Bologna, who, on the messenger's arrival, had him thoroughly searched in spite of my passports, and carried away all his letters, it having been well understood before his departure, as the express condition upon which the passport was granted, that he should not take charge of a single letter. By this means I acquired the conviction that a regular correspondence was kept up with England, since the greater part of those letters were replies to others which had been received from that country. I thus became acquainted with the names of the correspondents of both countries, and the letters also afforded me the means of protecting them from any calumnious imputation with which they might be charged, as they exhibited a clear proof that certain individuals, who were described to me as turbulent characters, never harbored the thought of creating the least disturbance. Whatever occurrences might have taken place to favor such a disposition, if they had entertained it, I suffered all those letters to reach their destination, and threw my nets into the channels therein pointed out for transmitting the replies. This success, however inconsiderable, suggested to me the idea of not only favoring the transit of such letters instead of obstructing it, but also of availing myself of any advantage they might afford me. I should have looked in vain along the whole extent of the coast from Dieppe to Blankenberg for the object of my search. Every movement was too well concerted in those quarters. I contrived another mode of carrying my views into effect. I sent on an excursion along the coast of England to agents of great dexterity and a respectable appearance, who were afterwards to return clandestinely to France. These agents, thus disguised, were not likely to create any mistrust on the British coast. They were accordingly well received and even assisted. They each carried a small parcel of contraband goods, which tended to increase the number of their friends, and an intercourse was eventually opened for the one who was to embark at Gravesend with the fishermen from Ostend and its vicinity, who carried on a petty traffic with England. He saw them approach the coast of England, land their passengers, not one of whom was in rule, and deliver up the letters entrusted to their care. And he entered into an agreement with one of them to take him back to France and land him in safety, so as to enable him to reach Belgium. By this means he returned to Ostend, and was from thence conducted from one station to another until he reached the depot of English prisoners at Valenciennes, who always proceeded on the same road on their way to the place of embarkation whenever they succeeded in effecting their escape. On this occasion, I killed two birds with one stone, first by deranging this line of communication, and afterwards establishing another in imitation of it, for the purpose of favoring the escape of our prisoners from England. But the discovery of a boat which clandestinely proceeded from the coast of Gravesend became, at a later period, a mine for my ingenuity to explore. I caused arrangements to be entered into with the master of the boat, promised never to arrest him, but on the contrary to allow of his passing to and fro if he took proper care to conceal his movements, but on condition that when he should have conveyed any Frenchman across, whether from one shore to another, he would faithfully apprise me of the circumstance. Those in England who saw him bringing over French passengers felt no difficulty in embarking with him, but the passengers whom he was conveying there were only taken on their return, because they were generally the bearers of many letters with regular addresses upon them, whereas on their departure for England they usually took letters without any signature, and were ignorant of the sources from whence they emanated. As soon as anyone was arrested by these means, his letters were put into circulation. After copies had been taken of the contents and directions, a regular correspondence was thereby set on foot in a very short time, as in consequence of a police agent having spread the report in Belgium of his knowing a secure channel through which anything might be forwarded to England, everyone entrusted him with letters and commissions. This was productive of a lucrative income to the agent, who was faithful to my trust and useful to the inhabitants. I have gained the further object that this proprietor of boats, unwilling to submit to the competition of his rivals in the contraband traffic, gave information respecting every Dutch or Blankenberg boat which he met at Gravesend, and he was the means of making me acquainted with the line of communications established between Longwy and Blankenberg, to which latter place the English prisoners were guided through the forest of Ardennes, Liège, and Belgium. He also furnished me with demonstrative evidence that I was occasionally imposed upon by my own agents, an imposition of which I took no notice, as it had no other effect than to promote their trifling pecuniary profits. My sport along this coast was very successful. This traffic had existed for many years, and the public service seemed to require that a stop should be put to it. I allowed the cry of tyranny to be raised against me, but insisted upon being obeyed. I was furnished with no less important information by the other agent, who returned by the coast of Picardy. He had proceeded as far as London, and established in that capital a means of correspondence which was so carefully kept up by my superior agents on the coast that they procured me regular intelligence from London in the space of 72 hours, and as often as an extraordinary cabinet council was held or any important intelligence was received from Spain, an extraordinary courier was sent to me, by which means the emperor was as quickly informed of the news as if the courier had come from no greater distance than Metz. Amongst the letters which I caused to be examined at Ostend were found those written to the Prince Regent of England by the ex-Queen of Etruria, who was living in retirement at Nice. They brought to my knowledge that this princess had sent, some months before, as her agent to the British government, a subject of Tuscany, who, for want of sufficient funds to proceed on his journey, had been compelled to remain at Amsterdam, where he was still waiting for replies to the urgent solicitations he had transmitted to the ex-queen at her residence at Nice. I caused him to be arrested at Amsterdam and sent on to Paris. He carried about his person the powers with which he was invested as chargé d'affaires from the ex-queen of Etruria, his instructions to repair to England, and the letters from this princess to the Prince Regent. She had even made her son write to the prince. The child's handwriting was that of a mere schoolboy who could only pen large letters upon ruled paper. Besides these documents, the chargé d'affaires had many other papers belonging to the princess, which were greatly calculated to compromise her. She had directed him to lay all that trash before the English government as a proof that she might serve their cause, in consequence of the attachment of the Spaniards for her person, and of her having it in her power to do an essential injury to the French by inducing the Spanish prisoners confined in the depots of Languedoc to rise in a body against their jailers. There were found, in fact, amongst those papers several letters from Spanish officers with whom she had been tampering for some time and feeding them with the hope of an insurrection by declaring that she would place herself at their head on their return to Spain. These letters established beyond all doubt that she had written to persuade them to this course and had obtained from them every promise she desired. It was an act of absolute folly, which must have ended in the destruction of the unhappy prisoners. The ex-queen was well aware of it, and I really believe she had only made all this stir in order to give herself an air of importance with the British government, from whom she was anxious to obtain some pecuniary assistance. The most rigid inquiry was instituted into the whole affair. The emperor forgave the chargé d'affaires of the ex-queen, but with respect to herself, he had her removed to the convent in Rome, to which the Princess of Parma, her relative, had retired to a life of seclusion. He ordered that expresses should be sent to her father, King Charles IV, who was at Marseille, and to the Spanish princes at Valencia, with the communication of all the documents which had placed him under the necessity of adopting that course, and his orders were punctually obeyed. The ex-queen traveled with a retinue of 2 or 3 carriages, the expenses of which were defrayed until her arrival in Rome. Her son had been taken away from her and sent to Charles IV, his grandfather. A feeling of respect for this monarch prevented any publicity of the above circumstances, and I ask any rational man what he would have thought had he seen collected together in a printed form all the papers that had been seized upon the person of the chargé d'affaires of the ex-queen of Etruria, coupled with the letters she had written from the very palace of Madrid to the Grand Duke of Berg, wherein she gave him at different hours of the day a detailed account of the acts and movements of her brother, the present King Ferdinand VII. It will be in the recollection of my readers that they had been sent to the emperor. Her conduct on that occasion had raised a prejudice against her. The emperor therefore preferred allowing a free vent to the outcry raised against this pretended act of despotism rather than add to the affliction of King Charles IV by placing him under the painful necessity of despising his own daughter. Thus it was that while searching along the coast of Belgium for the clue to the clandestine communications kept up with England, my attention was directed to the shores of the Mediterranean and to the depots of prisoners of war at Carcassonne, Tournon, and other places where a conviction was entertained that I had a host of spies at my command. By thus making myself the channel of secret intercourse carried on with England, I gradually became intimately acquainted with whatever came from foreign countries. I looked to Germany and England, and reciprocally of what was sent to those countries, because the old custom of writing by way of Brussels was still generally prevalent throughout the Austrian dominions. A great part of the correspondence sent to London by way of Holland came likewise to merge in that which was carried on by the coast of Ostend, so that in a very short time I acquired a treasure of addresses for every country. As many of the letters were sent in duplicate, one of the sets was retained as a specimen of the writer's hand until the author of the letters should become personally known. It sometimes happened by these means that without leaving my closet, I was a party to the intercourse kept up between Vienna and London, and particularly between the lesser German courts and the latter city. Many persons were on the alert to find out the spies whom they imagined to be watching their movements, whilst my clue for ascertaining what concerned them was no other than I have been describing. Chapter 5. I had effectually succeeded at last in discovering the various channels of intercourse between London and the most distant parts of the continent, and consequently in becoming acquainted with some official agents of the British government, who, without being vested with an acknowledged public character, proceeded nevertheless in every direction to carry on the business entrusted to their care. I likewise discovered, by an attentive search into the clandestine correspondence, the names of the parties who had agreed to meet at the waters of Bohemia, Italy, Baden, and Aix-la-Chapelle. Oftentimes, when the societies were not yet assembled, I knew the greater part of those who were to compose it, and according as I considered them calculated to afford some gratification to my curiosity, I selected some of our would-be genteel people who asked no better than to repair to those scenes of enjoyment which always possess sufficient attractions for the amateurs of gambling and of idle pleasures. Some I have found to be so expert as to have their expenses defrayed by the dupe of their impositions, and of whose carriage and servants they made a very unceremonious use. They afterwards succeeded in being conveyed back by some female, and actually returned to Paris without having opened their purse strings, with money won at gambling, and even with the affection of those whose ruin they had accomplished. 2 or 3 such excursions were sufficient to give a thorough insight into the habits of a whole country. There were no better sources of information than what were afforded by the societies at bathing places, where all restraint is laid aside, the hours hang heavily on hand, and freedom of communication is an indispensable enjoyment. To all those sources of information I could not but attach great importance, as I conceived that the clouds gathering in foreign countries would sometimes come to obscure our own atmosphere. For when I read a piece of intelligence in any letter, whether from London or other places, and found it in general circulation, I was at no loss to ascertain the source from whence it sprang. I had been wrongfully accused of attempting to meddle in politics. A weak mind alone is incapable of distinguishing between being correctly informed and inducing others to speak without disguise. I felt the more anxious to be quickly apprised of everything through different channels, as the exterior indications of tranquility or alarm had a corresponding effect upon our internal condition. I was about to explore the universities of Germany, when an accident happened to me which too clearly demonstrated its absolute necessity. I will presently relate this circumstance after disposing of what more immediately applies to England. Monsieur Martin, the police commissary at Bologna, was a man who combined with the most polished manners very considerable talents. He was, above all, incapable of failing in the duties he owed his country. I had procured him his appointment, and always had reason to applaud my choice and to be satisfied with his conduct towards me. under more unfavorable circumstances. He had so thoroughly penetrated into the spirit of the English periodical publications that independently of the information they contained, he drew consequences from them which served him as a guide in what he was desirous of ascertaining. He acquired such a reputation for vigilance along that coast that nothing was impossible to him. He greatly increased the facility of escape for French prisoners. In conformity with the orders I had given him to that effect, he favored the evasion of some of them from an island inland distance of 50 leagues. I was unacquainted with the resources he had at command, but he would have sent to pick the very pockets of a king. He had found it necessary to do so, and what was of still greater advantage, he knew when to set his springs in motion and when to desist from his enterprise. This facility of communication along the coast of Bologna could not escape observation in London, where it was calculated to create the same effect that was produced in France by the discovery of an intercourse which was supposed to be a profound secret. English commerce, therefore, could not resist the temptation of approaching the coast, gradually acquired confidence, and finally transmitted its letters in that direction. Not one of them was kept back. They were, however, very strictly examined. And until this little contrivance became known, some important matters were always divulged, not by the commercial letters themselves, but by others which were generally enclosed in them. Those letters were followed by a few travelers and again by some returns. Matters had gone on so far as to have opened that communication with England, which it was deemed necessary to establish with the view of discovering the nature and extent of her intercourse with us. It would otherwise have been necessary to carry on vexatious proceedings against everyone in order to ascertain what might sometimes have no existence whatever. Because when nothing is correctly seen or known, prudence enjoins the utmost circumspection. Whilst my attention was directed to the coast of Flanders and Picardy, a much more guilty correspondence was carrying on between Bordeaux and Lisbon. I soon acquired proofs of the fact, but the events occurred in too rapid succession to enable my following it up, the rather so as it involved certain high personages, whom I did not suspect to be guilty of a conduct which will be stated in its naked truth. They loaded in the Garonne by means of licenses several cargoes of wine, brandy, and flour, which were sent for the express purpose of supplying the English army at Lisbon. It was supposed that I always had agents about the residence of the Prince of the House of Bourbon. This was assuredly not the case. On one occasion only, I was furnished with every domestic detail concerning the residence they occupied by means of old servants who had returned to France. But I never sent anyone there on a special mission in the first place. Such a measure would have been useless, so long as we could make all Europe tremble from one extremity to the other. The palace of Hartwell was not much to be dreaded, and when we no longer commanded obedience in Paris, it was too late to attend to that object. Besides which, I believe the emperor himself would have taken in very bad part that any other means had not been resorted to if there had existed any motives for keeping a watchful eye upon that palace, added to which the English newspapers said as much as we could wish to learn respecting any domestic movements. The zeal of my subordinate agents never relaxed, and I rewarded them well for it. But as one grows weary of everything, as the cord loses its elasticity by being overstretched, I endeavored to strengthen my means of communication by giving to foreigners themselves an interest in keeping it up, so as to be able, under all circumstances, to rely upon their punctuality. In furtherance to this object, I afforded special and almost exclusive protection to those who carried on the trade in guineas, and in consequence of having put down the competition existing between several Englishmen, I succeeded in procuring such large profits to those towards whom I extended my protection that so far from refusing me any service, they were anxious to anticipate my wishes. Being themselves personally interested in obtaining early information of those political events which had an influence in raising or depressing the public funds, I might rely upon them as securely as it were their own interest to communicate to me the first knowledge they might acquire of any important occurrence as soon as the newspaper arrived. If I found there had been any neglect on their part in giving me timely notice, it was sufficient punishment to delay for a few hours the delivery of their letters. The world in general can form no idea of the advantage for a man in business to receive his letters from London before the hour of change. As for those who brought me good news, I allowed the courier who was the bearer of them to take charge also of their commercial letters. Some men were simple enough to say everywhere that there must exist a channel of private communication with England. It required no conjurer to find that out, but their minds were on the rack to come at a source of more valuable information. The Prince of Neuchatel has told me that during the whole time of Marshal Massena's remaining stationary before Lisbon, when all communication with him was cut off, it was only through the reports which I obtained in this manner that the Emperor had acquired a knowledge of the situation of his affairs in Portugal, and was enabled to decide upon the course which he thought proper to adopt. On the other hand, I sent to London certain instructions for obtaining fresh information. I discovered by the means to which I have adverted that a quantity of letters were addressed to one particular house in London, and soon learned that it was the best hotel in that capital, what we call in France an excellent inn, at which foreigners generally alighted. I took care to call for the names of all the travelers who arrived there. A list of the lodgers at a hotel is very easily made out when no previous one exists, and is easily procured in the contrary case. When this list was compared with the record kept at Gravesend, where the alien office registered the names of all foreigners on their arrival, and both were again compared with the reports of the Ostend boatmen, I found that there existed another means of communicating with England which had hitherto been unknown to me. There was little probability of its eluding my search. I had succeeded in tracing a foreigner from London to his original point of departure, and was at this time made acquainted with the voyage of an officer belonging to the Prince of Orange, who then resided in Berlin, and had sent him to the hereditary prince of that family, who was serving in the English army in Portugal. It was natural to suppose that some important matters must have been in agitation when an officer had been dispatched to the young prince from so great a distance. I had him watched on his return, gave information of the fact that he was arrested at Hamburg with all his letters. The case had been treated with too much severity at Hamburg, since it was not yet known whether the voyage was connected with any political intrigue. I did all in my power to assuage the misfortune, which was the only reward for the fidelity of this worthy officer, who had displayed great fortitude and resignation under such severe treatment. His wife hastened to join him from Berlin in the utmost state of agitation. I allowed her every facility she could desire for seeing him, and afterwards set her husband at liberty. He appeared to have been sent to the young Prince of Orange by the prince's own father respecting family affairs, which were of no public interest, with this exception, however, that the letters brought back were replies to the advice given to him by his father to solicit the hand of the Princess Royal of England, a connection not much to the young prince's taste. He alleged as his motive an apprehension of not finding in that union the happiness which is the only object of marriage, without a certainty of which he would renounce all thoughts of it. He plainly said, in short, that he feared he never could accustom himself to the domineering conduct which he thought it would be the lot of her future husband to submit to. This was no praise of the Princess of England, and his mind had not yet acquired a philosophical turn respecting the female character. It was no doubt his wish that the Princess Charlotte should be nothing more than Princess of Orange, but that he should become a Prince of England. By means of that establishment in London, I was enabled to discover the names of all the persons arriving from the Hanse Towns, from Prussia, Saxony, and even Austria, which last country requested permission of us, as will hereafter be seen, to send her couriers through Calais in order to throw us off the scent of those which she sent through the north of Germany. They certainly succeeded in escaping from my grasp, because they traveled through Saxony, Prussia, Denmark, and occasionally Heligoland to London, where my agent witnessed their arrival. Had it not been for the misfortune which subsequently occurred, I should have eventually drawn them into my nets, not with the view of preventing their proceeding on their journey, nor even of retarding it, but merely to cast an eye over the contents of their dispatches, which were unquestionably of a different complexion from those which that cabinet transmitted by way of Calais. The result of this would have been that the couriers who were supposed to have eluded our search would have been exposed to it, and those who were expected to be searched would have been allowed to pass unmolested. I was well acquainted with the road by which they proceeded, and must inevitably have fallen upon some means between Vienna and Denmark of discovering the exact truth. All this mystery brought gloomy reflections to my mind, whilst they compelled me to acknowledge that we made no progress towards a state of tranquility, and that if we were not yet involved in difficulties, the public feeling in foreign countries was unanimous respecting France, and a single reverse of fortune would be sufficient to ruin our cause. The more we obstructed the intercourse of England with the rest of Europe, the more general and the stronger became the desire to open a friendly intercourse with her. The most odious epithets were accordingly leveled at us by those whose views were thwarted by our measures. For this unnatural state of things, the only remedy was peace. All parties sighed for it, and it might have been obtained had it not been for all the intrigues, all the private and foreign ambitions which had combined to mislead the emperor. His enemies saw full well that a peace would fix his power upon an imperishable basis. They resolved to sap it by war, and were so far successful as to persuade the French that the emperor desired it, an imputation to which they yielded a credulous assent. Before pursuing this point any further, I must not omit to state by what means I sounded the feelings of those who had survived the Civil War in the west of France and who resided in England. This branch of the police labors was placed in a very skillful hand, and a correct statement had been drawn up of all who had figured in the different parties which had successfully desolated the western provinces. An agent was kept in London, whose sole occupation was to visit them every fortnight, pass them, as it were, in review, and whenever anyone disappeared, immediately to give notice of it. And they were sought for in that part of France where they had served during the period of the civil commotions, previously to their flying to England. If they eluded our search, some trace of them was always to be discovered, because the first want felt by an individual thus thrown upon the coast was to proceed in quest of the old acquaintances he had left behind. Scarcely any one of those who were sent in this manner from England could succeed in escaping detection. Some of them were afterwards found disposed to give information respecting others, and we thus became acquainted with all the roads taken by these unfortunate men, who were sent to certain death because the servants of curates themselves, or other persons in the confidence of the police being once known, preferred giving information of whatever happened to them rather than expose themselves to misfortune. It must be allowed that I was tolerably well acquainted by this time with my chessboard, both in the provinces and beyond the frontier. Chapter 6. We were at the beginning of the autumn of 1810. The emperor had at this time on his hands the affairs to be arranged with the Pope and the management of the campaign in Portugal. Our army had entered Andalusia and even marched upon Cadiz. The sieges of the towns in Catalonia were pushed on with great activity. The administration of the Illyrian provinces was organized into a distinct government. That is to say, they had their special budget of receipts and expenditure, and their resources and wants were no longer mixed up with those of other provinces, a proof they were not destined to remain in our possession. Whenever a favorable opportunity might offer for exchanging them, Marshal Marmont had the government of this small state, of which Laibach was the chief town. A circumstance happened to him which would appear quite incredible if we had not both been eyewitnesses of the occurrence. A Sicilian brig of war hove in sight of one of the small ports of Dalmatia under pretense of avoiding the Neapolitan coast, where it was apprehensive of being betrayed, and landed an officer belonging to the Sicilian Navy, who was in the confidential employment of the late Queen of Naples and Sicily. She sent him officially to the principal officer in command, for whom he was the bearer of a most extraordinary commission. Marshal Marmont having sent him to me, I interrogated him and received his written declaration, to which he affixed his signature. It related that the Queen of Sicily, who was impatient to shake off the English yoke, had resolved to attempt it by renewing against them the Sicilian Vespers, as soon as she might feel satisfied that in the event of failure she might rely upon finding an asylum, not in the kingdom of Naples, but in some other part of Italy under the French dominion. The officer added that everything was in readiness for the execution of the project, which was to take place immediately after his return to Sicily. He laid open all the means of success which the Queen had at her command, and there is no doubt, in fact, that unless this guilty attempt should fully answer the object in view, it would have doomed many, as unfortunate wretch, to certain destruction. After receiving the declaration of the Sicilian officer, it became my duty to communicate it to the emperor. He read the whole proposal and could not repress his indignation at the presumption that he could have lent his assistance to such a cowardly massacre. He ordered me to detain for an indefinite period, that is to say, until the conclusion of the war, the Sicilian officer, who was in consequence lodged in the castle of Vincennes, where he was still confined when the Allies entered Paris. He has since died. His name was Amelia, and must still be found inserted in the registers of the court of that dungeon, where it may readily be seen. A few months after this event, the foreign newspapers alluded to the discovery made by the English in Sicily of a project for putting them to death, and several arrests took place, which were followed by a trial and a capital punishment. There is no doubt that if I had not detained the Sicilian officer, he might have found his way back to the Queen and made her anticipate by 2 months a period for carrying the plan into effect, which would have happened previously to the English being apprised of it. It has been very prevalent opinion that every means of destroying the English would find acceptance with the emperor. In refutation of this, I have just related a fact which is personal to him and is still unknown in France, because he had ordered me not to divulge it to the world. I have already mentioned that the emperor sent Marshal Massena to assume the command of the army which was opposed to the enemy along the Douro. It penetrated into Portugal, came up with the English at Busaco, and was unable to attack them in proper time. It marched upon the English in a compact body, but they had likewise concentrated their forces and were strongly posted on all the heights from whence it was found impossible to dislodge them. Our army fortunately discovered a road which they had neglected to protect, and continued its advance by a bold flank movement which the enemy did not venture to obstruct. But as everything is pretty evenly compensated in all human actions, it soon met with wholly unexpected obstacles and arrived in front of the lines of Torres Vedras, which the Anglo-Portuguese had long before put into a state of defense, and it soon had to encounter every species of privation. While said army was thus advancing through numberless difficulties, the corps commanded by Marshal Bessières in Castile remained in a state of inaction. Had it been ordered by the emperor to join in the invasion, Marshal Massena would have added it to his own forces. But this was beyond his power, and a corps which would have been of such essential service to him under the walls of Lisbon, where he was prevented from molesting the English whilst carrying on their works of defense, remained perfectly stationary. Had it even moved upon Coimbra, it would have spared the army of Marshal Massena the necessity of dividing itself into numberless detachments, which were compelled to scour the country for the purpose of providing subsistence for the troops that remained in camp. Thus it happened that one half of that army was engaged on detached services, and that plunder was converted into a system under pretext of organizing the means of subsistence. In a short time, it became unable to undertake any attack against the English army, which was daily increasing in numbers and was abundantly supplied with everything it stood in need of. Both armies allowed the bad season to pass in this manner, the one in need of the most indispensable articles, the other luxuriating in abundance. The army of Marshal Massena might be said to have disappeared from the living. So little was it spoken of, owing to the difficulties thrown in the way of all the communications by the insurrectionary hands which infested the country. The only intelligence obtained of it was through the reports I had found the means of procuring from London, where they were copied from Lord Wellington's dispatches. We ascertained by this means that the English and carried off and sent to England whatever Marshal Massena had left at Coimbra. It also was the means of informing the emperor of the retreat of that marshal and of enabling him to send Bessieres to his support. Had it not been for this channel of information, the English army would have driven Massena to the very cantonments occupied by Bessieres, who had not received such timely information as to be enabled to assemble his army for immediate action. The emperor blamed Massena for having thus ventured to advance upon Lisbon without having it in his power to carry that city. He would have preferred his confining the seat of war to the neighborhood of Coimbra, from whence he might have annoyed the English army so effectually as to compel it to re-embark. There is no doubt that Massena might have stood his ground in that city, but he would have infallibly subjected himself to animadversion for doing so, and to the remark that if he had moved upon Lisbon without stopping, he would not have allowed the English any breathing time, but would have entered the capital pell-mell with them. There would, in fact, have been some tolerable pretext for this objection, which envy or malignity might easily have turned to Marshal Massena's prejudice. There could indeed have been no doubt of success if the corps of Marshal Bessieres had joined Massena's army, and the English troops would have been no sooner embarked than Cadiz must of necessity have fallen, and the affairs of Spain have undergone a favorable change, since the obstacles which they presented were exclusively owing to the proximity of those troops. At the close of the bad season, Marshal Massena's army had drained the country of its resources without being in a more efficient condition for defeating the English army. He retreated and was closely pursued by the English, who annoyed him until he reached the frontiers of Spain after leaving a garrison in Almeida under the orders of General Bernier. He found the troops of Marshal Bessieres in readiness to support him, but had no occasion for their assistance. He brought his army safe back into Spain and reached Salamanca, from whence he was desirous that the corps of Marshal Ney should march upon Ciudad Rodrigo. This marshal refused to obey, and Massena removed him from the command of the troops. And sent him to Paris, the emperor gave Ney a gentle scolding, but he always forgave him in consideration of his bravery. Marshal Massena was afterwards desirous of making a forward movement with this whole army in order to throw supplies into Almeida. But a concurrence of untoward circumstances and the refractory disposition he met with would have rendered this a hazardous movement. Nevertheless, preparations were making for carrying it into effect when General Bernier arrived in person at the head of his garrison. After blowing up the powder magazine of that fortress and braving the pursuit of all the blockading troops, his bold feat of arms greatly redounded to his honor. The movement which the army had been ordered to make was rendered superfluous by the arrival of the garrison of Almeida, and it was accordingly countermanded. Thus, therefore, the campaign of Portugal, which had originally promised a definitive result, was only productive of losses and embarrassments. The army was completely exhausted, and the emperor, conceiving that it stood in need of rest, ordered it into cantonments upon the Douro, and recalled Marshal Massena himself, who was quite exhausted by fatigue and unable to bestow that attention to his troops which was necessary for restoring them to their former state of efficiency. He selected for his successor in the command Marshal Marmont, then governor of Illyria, whom he replaced by General Bertrand, now so celebrated by his noble constancy in following the emperor's fate. Thus closed the year of 1810. In respect to important military operations, the emperor had determined to send Marmont to Spain, because he felt great confidence in that officer, who was young and devoured by ambition. He was, besides, very skillful in establishing an efficient system of organization, acted with great severity, and was always opposed to plunder, which had the effect of making us more enemies in the war itself. The post which Marshal Marmont was about to assume offered him every opportunity of illustrating his fame, and he had no doubt entered upon it with the best possible intentions. I am indeed fully convinced if that of fortune had crowned his first efforts, as he was possessed of a great personal merit, he would surely have become the most useful man for the emperor's interest in Spain, and this was saying everything, for it may safely be asserted that the army stood in need of such a man, and that the services of many others might have been dispensed with. Ill fortune seemed to attach to those who were destined to serve in that country. All were impelled by zeal for the emperor's service. All were ambitious to please him and to secure his good graces, and no sooner were the means placed at their command of acquiring glory and even of obtaining what they had most ardently desired, then they turned their minds to other views. Envy and jealousy had taken up their abode in every breast. A spirit of rivalry prevented those combined movements which would have required the junction of troops formed from the different corps. In the midst of all their misunderstandings, Wellington was invested with an absolute authority over an army accustomed to submission, which he alternately moved up one or other of our corps, well aware that he had not to apprehend any impediment from the general whose neighbor he was about to attack. It is clear from the boldness of his movements that he must have been fully sensible of the power which this ground of security placed in his hands. Marshal Marmont reached Spain and assumed the command of the troops which Marshal Massena had brought back from Portugal. They were in a deplorable condition on their return from 4 months' encampment for the lines of Torres Vedras, in want of everything and reduced to the most severe privations. Their only subsistence during that long interval had been solely derived from compulsory requisitions made and enforced by detachments of troops organized for plundering. Those detachments, which often consisted of a third or even one half of each regiment, proceeded to a distance of 15 or 20 leagues and could only fulfill their mission by exercising acts of severe outrage. A disorganization, almost unparalleled, confusion and want of discipline were the consequence, and deprived it of the means of contending with the enemy. It had reached Ciudad Rodrigo with scarcely any cavalry or horses for the artillery, and with its material in the greatest disorder, the utmost disgust. In short, the most determined spirit of discontent had seized all ranks, from the generals to the subaltern officers and soldiers, and had everywhere taken the place of respect for duty and a love of military glory. The Duke of Ragusa soon triumphed over these difficulties and raised the fallen courage of his soldiers. He sent back to France all the generals who were broken down by fatigue or discontented, altered the organization of the several corps, and formed the army into 6 divisions of infantry and 1 of cavalry, caused its material to be completely reestablished, and the draft horses better attended to, and their numbers increased, formed depots of reserve provisions, and in less than 3 weeks the army was organized anew, restored to its wonted discipline, animated by a proper spirit, and in readiness for active operations. The emperor, far from expecting so prompt a result, had enjoined the Duke of Ragusa not to undertake any operation until his means of action were complete in all parts, and until he should have 60 pieces of cannon with their cartridges and ammunition. But the circumstances were of a most pressing nature and required the adoption of a different course. The siege of Badajoz by the English was vigorously carried on, and drawing to a close, the army under Marshal Soult in the south of Spain had been completely beaten by Albuera and could no longer undertake any movement. Badajoz could not be saved except by the prompt assistance of the army of Portugal. The Duke of Ragusa, who was fully sensible of the danger, and who was called to the south by the urgent entreaties of the Duke of Dalmatia, commenced his movement at the beginning of June with 30,000 infantry, 1,500 horse, and 36 pieces of cannon. He proceeded in person to Ciudad Rodrigo with a division of infantry, and all his cavalry drove back the English advance guard, which was within reach, and spread the report that he was resuming the offensive. Protected by this movement, the other 5 divisions advanced in the meanwhile by forced marches towards the Tagus by the Col de Banos, and was the movement. When it was in full operation, the troops which had proceeded in the direction of Ciudad Rodrigo formed the rear guard of the army and overtook it whilst in the act of crossing the river of Almaraz over a bridge which it had thrown over that place. As soon as the army reached Extremadura, it formed into platoons and marched upon Merida in a compact body, and always prepared to fight any portion of the English army which might have pressed upon its flank. This movement was effected with so much decision and promptness that it disconcerted all the enemy's plans and forced them to raise the siege of Badajoz at the moment when both our armies were forming a junction. This operation received its due meed of praise and approbation. It was a novel circumstance in Spain to see a French general supporting and relieving his near neighbor, and so far from taking advantage of the instructions which rendered his movements dependent upon the possession of a certain force which it had been found impossible to obtain, incur, on the contrary, the responsibility of a premature offensive movement, and place himself under the orders of one of his equals. It must be acknowledged, to the praise of the Duke of Ragusa on this occasion, that the glory of the French army and the public welfare were the sole motives of his conduct. The example thus held out ought to have served as a lesson to our generals during the remainder of the war of Spain, but self-love resumed the ascendancy, and the peninsula was lost to us. Marshal Marmont and Soult agreed upon the ulterior operations that they should adopt and return with their troops to their respective quarters. Chapter 7. Whilst the emperor was urging on the campaign of Portugal, he was not unmindful of the affairs of his own dominions. His discussions with the court of Rome particularly engrossed his attention, and he directed a consultation to be held on the subject by the most celebrated theologians and clergymen of Paris. They unanimously decided against the Pope, whom they accused of exercising his spiritual authority in a matter of purely temporal nature, with which the Church could have no concern. I have already stated that the disputes with the court of Rome had led to the occupation of the Civita Vecchia and Ancona. The Pope, who pretended that his power was as infallible in a temporal as in a spiritual point of view, protested against the seizure, which had not, however, taken place until after many fruitless representations. Italy and Rome, in particular, had already presented the spectacle of insurrectionary movements. The sanguinary scenes which usually attended them were too well known, and the Pope's personal character afforded no security against the renewal of them. The obstinacy which he displayed made it necessary to adopt measures of aggression. Troops were poured into the city of Rome to prevent its setting to the provinces. The example of revolt, which there was every reason to apprehend, was seriously meditated. Enraged at such conduct, the Pope, surrounded by priests of narrow understandings, thundered forth his bull of excommunication against the emperor and caused it to be circulated in Italy, France, Belgium, and Spain. Notwithstanding the emperor's indifference to that excommunication, he nevertheless felt uneasy at the prospect of the embarrassments into which it might involve him, more particularly as it would impose upon him the necessity of acting with severity towards the unfortunate people who might be led astray by some fanatic priests whose influence is always very powerful in the provinces, where the population is in a state of ignorance. These ideas assume the more gloomy aspect, as he was then at Vienna, and embarked in a war which might from one moment to another turn against him. If this had come to pass and the Pope had remained in Rome, it is greatly to be apprehended that the insurrection which would have spread over Italy, where the people were already beginning to rise, would have augmented the difficulties of the emperor's position at Vienna, and compelled him to conclude a less advantageous peace than he eventually secured. He had unfortunately little leisure to attend to the papal affairs, and had no one then about his person whom he could entrust with their management. His whole attention, therefore, was directed to the object of averting the possible consequences of the Pope's exasperation, which was now at its height, and would set all the engines of his power at work on the first favorable opportunity. He caused him, therefore, to be carried off and conveyed to Savona, where a suitable establishment had been provided for him. Such was the state of affairs when they were taken up after the emperor's marriage, which the cardinals thought fit not to attend. They were blamed by everyone, and even condemned by the faculty of theology for acting in this manner.